Welcome to Putting Together the Pieces Program 5. This program will demonstrate coding topics from the past few weeks with a look ahead at reading and writing text files. Here are the topics we will explore. 1. Using the standard library modules OS and os.path. Accessing folders and files. Writing text to a file. Reading text from a file. The program also incorporates using functions. This allows us to call a unit of code more than once. We will see this done in our program, as well as organize the program into cohesive functions that focus on doing one task well. The program also uses if-else for making decisions regarding what to do when a file or folder does not exist. We will be using two library modules, OS and os.path, so we need to import them first before we start any code instructions. This program will create a text file named Hello Text. It is to be created and stored on a thumb drive that has been mounted to the H drive of the computer inside a subfolder named PTP5 that is inside folder CSC-171. Currently, neither the PTP5 folder nor the Hello Text file exist. We will be using 4 helper functions called by main to complete our programming task. Let's examine what each function's job is within the program. First, notice the step-by-step process is controlled by main. Main will call the functions one after the other. This is often called controlling the flow of the program events. Main first sets the name of the file we wish to create into a local variable called new file. Look closely at the file name. This is the absolute path to the file. It includes the drive and the full directory path to the file. We will be using the os.path module to help us find files and folders and report their size. It will rely on the absolute path of the file. Now you may be wondering why we have extra backslashes in this path name. So let me explain. When we use Windows directories, it uses a single backslash to separate our folders and directory names. But because Python uses a backslash as the escape instruction, such as new line or tab, we need to add a second backslash to indicate that we really are including the actual backslash in the string. So we type 2 backslashes, but only one will be generated each time in the actual path name. After storing the path into the local variable new file, main calls check folder. Check folder will look for the PTP5 folder inside the CSC-171 folder. If it doesn't exist, it will make a new folder named PTP5 inside the CSC-171 folder. If it does already exist, it will do nothing. The next function, called check file size, is past the name of the file. Its job is to report how big the file is. Now, the very first time this program is run, Hello Text doesn't exist. So check file size will report that the file doesn't exist. Next, we call the write output file function, passing it the name of the file. Write output file will create the file and write the greeting into it. We will then call the check file size function again to verify that we wrote into the file, as it will report Hello Text file size. After writing to the file, we call read file for input, which reads the file contents back into the program and prints them out. Finally, we end the program with our standard salutation. Happy coding! Initially, the folder PTP5 in CSC 171 doesn't exist. Therefore, our program will need to create both the folder and the file hello.txt. Let's look closely at the first function that main calls, the check folder function. Its purpose is to create the PTP5 subfolder inside CSC 171 if it doesn't exist. Note the two functions highlighted in orange. These are pre-written functions that we are using from the OS and the os.path modules from the standard library. We can use these functions as part of our program because we imported them. The first instruction uses a function from the os.path module named exists. Given the absolute path for the PTP5 folder, it checks to see whether or not the folder already exists. If so, it returns true. If it does not exist, it will return false. We set its output to the yes or no variable and print to the screen the results of looking for the folder. If the folder does not exist, we create it using the os.makeDirs function, passing as input the full path name, also known as the absolute path, for folder PTP5. Many of the OS and os.path function names still use the old style term for a folder, which is directory. These two terms have the same meaning, an organized collection of other folders or directories and files. Hence the name of the function makeDirs, which can be used to create a series of folders or a single folder as we see here. The write output file function takes one input, which corresponds to the name of the file we will be using. The first instruction calls the open function, which returns a file object variable. Inside of write output file function, we will refer to the file objects variable by the name outFile. Notice the call to the open function has two input parameters. The first is the actual file name, and the second parameter corresponds to what kind of I/O operation will be done to the file. We are sending a W to indicate that this file should be opened for writing. This means that we will be writing text content to the file. If the file exists, it will be cleared out and we will replace it with new content. If the file doesn't exist, it will be created by the open function. Therefore, we don't have to check for the existence of the file before writing to it. The second instruction in the write output file function is a write file instruction that takes a string input parameter. This input will be written into the file. The last instruction closes the file. We need to remember to close the file when we are finished writing to it. Function check file size will help us verify that the output was written to the file. We use two os.path functions in this unit of code. The first if statement is needed to verify that the file exists before we try to examine its size property. If the file does not exist, we can't use the os.path.getSize function. It would cause our program to crash. Therefore, we skip to the else if the file doesn't exist and report that using a print statement. If the file does exist, we can gather information about it. For instance, we are using the getSize function to find out how big in bytes the file is. In other words, how much memory is it using? We store the result from calling getSize in the variable howBig, and then report the size of the file in bytes using the print function. The read file for input function accepts the file name as an input parameter and uses that in the os.path.exists function to check whether or not the file exists. If the file does not exist, we can't read its contents, so we follow the else path, print a file not found message, and we are done. However, as long as the file is found, we perform the open function again with the file name, but notice this time we use the parameter r for read. This means we will extract the contents of the file and use it inside our program. The next instruction uses the file object variable InFile, which we created from the result of the open function. InFile will be the name we use inside this function to refer to the file. We extract the text as a string into our program by assigning the result to myGreeting, which is a string variable. Next, we print a label and the stored input from myGreeting. We are finished using the file, so we remember to call the close function for InFile. Here are the results from running the program. The first function we called for main was checkFolder. There is no PTP5 folder, and so we see the return from the exists function of false. checkFolder then creates the directory for us. So PTP5 folder is inserted inside the CSC 171 folder mounted on the H drive of this computer. The next function call is to check file size, but the hello text file does not yet exist. And so we get the message that hello.txt does not exist. Main then calls write output file. This writes our message into the hello.txt file. And then we call check file size again. The results from the second call to check file size tell us that hello.txt is 40 bytes. We then call the read file for input function. This produces the output. Here are the contents of the file. Hello world, Python programming rocks. Finally, before closing the program, we print out our customary salutation, happy coding. Here is a screenshot of the CSC 171 folder now after running the program. We see the PTP5 folder open, and inside it is stored the hello.txt file. Let's run the program again. Here is our program. This time when we run the code, PTP5 folder exists and hello.txt exists. So our first call to check folder will result in not having to make another directory. Check file size, when we run it this time, will find hello.txt, and so the size will be 40. Let's change what we write into the output file. Instead of hello world, let's give everybody a heads up. There are only 61 shopping days left before Christmas. Now I'm not sure how big that is, but after we write output file and then call check file size again, we should see a different number of bytes. Finally, we call the read file for input, and this time it should report the message there are only 61 shopping days left before Christmas. Let's save it and run it. And here's our new output. We see that when we call check folder, it reports true that the PTP5 folder exists. Next we call check file size, and we see that hello text is 40 bytes. That was our original greeting message. We then call write output file and change what's stored in that file. to a warning about how many shopping days are left before Christmas. So the next time when we check file size, we see that Hello Text now has 55 bytes being used of storage. And finally, we call our read file for input, and that reports the new file contents that there are only 61 shopping days left before Christmas. Our last line of code is print happy coding. Just a few notes about using files. First, some file location issues. The default folder is the current folder your Python program resides in. If we don't give the complete path name, which is termed the absolute path, then your program will look in the folder where your program.py file resides. 2. When writing to a file, you need to open the file with W for writing. It will automatically create the file if it doesn't already exist. If it does exist, it will clear it out and replace all the contents with whatever you write into it. We just saw that demonstrated with our new Shopping Days Till Christmas message. If you want to append to the contents of the file, in other words, add to the file instead of replacing what already exists, then you use the input argument A to append or add to the current file's contents. And 3, when reading from a file, we use the R input argument. Unlike writing to a file, the program will throw an error if the file does not exist and you attempt to read from it. Therefore, you should always check to be sure it is available before you attempt to read from an input file. Finally, when reading and writing to input files, you should always remember to close the file when you're finished. Happy coding!